Okay, this is welcome to Alaska Archaeology. So you might want to take a few notes, but I will be telling you what you need to know and what you should write down. So we could spend an entire semester just on this subject, but I'm just going to try to limit it to, this one module. And with that said, and before we get to all the specific Alaska stuff, what I want to do is just go over the basics of archaeology so you have a understanding of it. So here's your crash course. What is archaeology? And if you can't read the cartoon, it says, I say we take our shovels, cover this back up, and never, I mean never, speak of it again. So you have to ask yourself, what's the humor in that joke? Sometimes I do give cartoons on exams and I'll say, well, what's funny about it? Because if you don't get it, if you don't have the information, you're not going to understand the joke. So a good definition is that it's the scientific and systematic study of material remains. So what's the most important word in that sentence? If this was a real lecture, I'd ask you that. And in my estimation, the word material is the most important because when you're an archaeologist, you are like a detective. All you have are artifacts that make up a puzzle. And these are your clues in trying to figure out how people lived. So the question is, what's the definition of an artifact and what's a site? You do need to know these. Do you know? Okay, well, I'll tell you. An artifact is something made or used by man. A site is a place used or modified by man. So the underlying theme in this is there has to be evidence of man. If you just find mammoth bones, those are not artifacts, and where you find them, it's not a site. If you're a paleontologist, it could be, but not an archaeologist. And this brings us to the difference between artifacts and features. So what's an artifact and what's a feature? Well, artifact is something made or used by man. A feature is just at another level of analysis. It means something made or used by man, but you're not going to pick it up and take it with you. So a house you're not going to take with you. You're not going to take a fence. A burial, you're really not going to pick up a burial and take it with you. A midden or a garbage dump. These are all things that are features because you're not going to move them. And then there's also what are called attributes. So here are a bunch of artifacts, and how would you classify them? Well, you could look at material, right? You don't know for sure looking at a picture, but they're all made out of rock. They're all sharp. They're all serrated at the edges, meaning that they've all been worked and made sharp. So attributes are the smallest levels of analysis. Everything has attributes. And so the big thing you have to take away from all this is that separately, at a site, one artifact is not going to tell us the story. But what you have to do is you have to look at everything in the big picture, okay? And when you have all the pieces, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, right? You're able to put it all together and then get an idea how people lived. So one thing you need to know is what's the scientific method? And you should look that up. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm going to go back to this for a second. So if I ever ask you, is archaeology a science? How would you answer that? Well, hopefully after reading all the material and looking at the videos I posted for you, you will understand it. But basically, the way you would answer that question is it a science? Well, it's a science if it uses the scientific method, and you would have to state what the scientific method is, and then make your argument that way. The other thing that's really important in archaeology is context. Now, basically, all that means is where the artifact was found. So again, you have to document the location, what was around it, where in the stratigraphy it was found. And this is why the archaeologists graph everything out. So context means you can't really tell one artifact or anything about it unless you know its context. You need to know what was found around it. It's like the jigsaw puzzle. If you take one piece out of the puzzle and just toss it somewhere, you're not going to be able to tell what puzzle it came from if you have a bunch of them. So a lot of times people will bring me artifacts, and my grandfather found a projectile point on the Pecos River in 1950. What can I tell them? What can you tell me about it? And what I always have to say is, I can't tell you anything because it's been taken out of its archaeological context. So that's really important. And so again, you need to understand how archaeologists use the scientific method when they do archaeology. Now, I want to go through this pretty fast, but these are the goals of archaeology: to reconstruct past lifeways, to study culture histories, and explain cultural processes. So I'm going to go through each one. The first thing is that to study cultural history, it means just that. Looking at the history of a culture. The second is we'll go back here, reconstruct past lifeways. Okay, reconstructing past lifeways is just trying to find out how people lived. So the way you reconstruct it is you look at all the pieces of the puzzle, you look at all your artifacts, and then from there you can get an idea of how these people lived. Now, to study cultural processes, that's a little more complicated, and that's looking at why is it that artifacts change over time. So can you think of things that have stayed the same in form and function over time in your lifetime with stylistic variations? Again, I like the example of silverware because basically you can go back to the 1700s, a fork's a fork, a spoon, but they might look a little different. Bowls, tables, combs, brushes. These are all things that have stayed the same in form and function over time. So a lot of this stuff archaeologists know right away. But can you think of things in your own life that have changed form but kept the same function? Here's an example that I like. Okay, a record. If you don't know what that is, that's a record. Then we went to 8-tracks. Then we went to cassettes, CDs, and now digital media. So the question is, over time, let's say all written records have been destroyed. 1,000 years from now, will archaeologists be able to tell that these were all related? Maybe yes, maybe no. So these are the kinds of problems that we face as archaeologists.